before we start? Okay. OG, are you guys here? OG? Okay, opening opposition. Are you guys here?
Toba is here. Dan, are you here?
Okay. CG, CO? CO?
CO here.
Okay, great. Just a quick roll call for the judges. Wait, hold up. Right.
Yep,
Kak
here.
Fikri? Leo?
I'm here.
I'm here,
Moti?
Kak.
Okay,
Yep,
Shahid?
here.
All right, great. So since everyone is here, just let me establish a few ground rules. First one is that if you're an observer, that means that you won't be speaking in this chamber, so please don't forget to mute yourself. Second is that before you start your speech, don't forget to mention your preferred method of POI. If someone does not mention their preferred method of POI, then just assume that it goes through chat. That's why I would also like for you guys to steer clear of the chat. If you guys want to show support or do other things, you can always use the reaction button, but just make sure that the chat is cleared for POI and so on and so forth. Right. The third thing is that when you're talking about closure, the topic can be a little bit sensitive. So if you guys have any content of your speeches that could trigger a few people, don't forget to put trigger warning. And so, yeah, I guess that's all. Maybe quick introduction for each of my panels. But before that, my name is Madeline. I will be chairing here, but would like for you guys to assume us as panels to be more inclusive. Maybe Kak Fikri?
Yeah, hi, Kevin Marvel. Good luck for the final.
Okay. Leo?
Hello, Leonardo.
Right. Moti?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Uti, and
Last but not least, Said.
Hi, it's Said. So good luck for everyone.
Right. So with that being said, without further ado, we'll call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Hi, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Beforehand, I just want to really express my gratitude. It's quite an achievement, and I'm honored to be here in the concurrent panels. So thanks to all judges and committee. Gender pronouns is she or her, and POI method is by opening your mic, because I will not be saying the chat box. Yeah, that's pretty much all. With that being said, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 important setups before going to my substantive in this debate. Firstly, we're okay with people's choice. That is to say, if you want closure or not, if you hate it or if you love it, that's up to you. I think every human sense or valid and individual agency to exist, and it's valid, right? But second, what you have to notice and what you have to note down on opening government is that we don't regret them asking for closure or psychological closure, whatever name it, but we regret the glorification that exists in that manifestation. So the manifestation that exists and opposition have to defend is how, when you glorify others, you press other people to get closure, even though, for example, to some extent, I think that the problem has been solved. That is what we think why glorification is problematic in head, right? But a third point of framing is, instead of glorification, what opening government stands for in this debate is that we are going to glorify pursuing acceptance. That is to say, if things cannot be ganggu gugat anymore, if then that is the end, if then there is no other choices for you to be made, or even the law or criminal justice system has fully given you the justice you deserve, then that's it, and that's how you accept things. That has already been, happened in the past, right? 2 arguments then I'm going to explain in my speech. First, why glorification of psychological closure is problematic. But secondly, I'm going to also explain and engage in the most vulnerable actors, we say here victims. So my second argument will play on how victims can have personal acceptance. We believe that this is really important. Let's go to the first argument then. Why glorification of closure is problematic? I have 2 layers of explanation for this. The first is because closure, we think, is contingent upon you being satisfied towards other people, because closure exactly relies on what response you get from other people. What is the problem in this? The problem with that is because the psychological closure that you inherently want comes from your expectation. And since every individual is unique, it means that different individual wants different demands upon what kind of closure they want at the end of the day. What is the problem with that? When you realize that closure is contingent upon other people, exactly because everyone is unique on their own, you cannot expect them to always understand you, to always give the justification or the validation that you want. Simply this looks like, for example, in competitions, you are not satisfied with only semangat, but you want a further validation that your teammate, for example, and even your friends cannot simply just give because they don't know you that much, or they don't know what stage of they cannot simply read your mind, right? And that is where it feels problematic, because not only that disqualification further hampers you as a person, but also hampers other people, and that is why we say it is bad. But problem with this is that the problem is this exactly because we don't see any parameter at all. When closure is achievable, it is very shaky and arbitrary. What is the harm in this? Firstly, you have conflicts with your friends, or simply someone, or simply the check and balance societal that constantly is around you, right? But second, we know that this makes victims even worse. Because, for example, in sexual harassment cases, even though, for example, the criminal justice system has already given a full sentence toward the perpetrator, it doesn't mean that completely, you're going to get psychological closure you want as a victim. Maybe you want an even better support or whatever that is that only you can understand, and that is where it gets confusing, right? But second layer then, later, Hans, we think that why glorification should not rely on this is because glorification makes you pressure you into getting overwhelming sense of justice. The premise of this argument is to say as if the framing is to say as if closure is always the answer and there is no other alternative to that. We say there is other achievable alternative which is comparatively even healthier, and that's why opening government self-acceptance. Why is this argument important? We say it's because we inherently explain why there's no parameter of how this is going to be achievable, and that is why it is arbitrary, and that's why the glorification cannot qualify on something that is really shaky. But before I go into my second argument, Hans.
Two things. First, will you push people to do self-acceptance? But secondly, if your argument is about inconsistency of parameter of closure, why does it make?
Number one, no. If I flag on top of my speech, if people do want closure, and sure, we just regret the glorification. But what we're trying to prove to you is that we have other alternatives other than you asking for consent closure and such. But secondly, I think there's a distinction between you simply asking for closure and having acceptance, because acceptance is when you kind of gave up to some extent. I think it's more of you accepting what has happened and how you try to make yourself a better person instead of always asking for validation. Second argument then, how victims can have better self-acceptance. I'm going to really go briefly, and the premise of this argument is to say, and firstly preempt, because I feel like opposition is going to say, oh, when you have self-acceptance, it means you force people to forgive a perpetrator, for example, or those who have offended you. We say no. We say self-acceptance does not indicate that victims immediately forgive, but we say that it's also stages of griefs, or like the 5 stage of grief also happens, and there's always a process in accepting. Meaning that we're not going to impulsively forgive someone, but there's always a circumstance in that. But note that why self-acceptance is important and why it is comparatively healthier than having psychological closure. Because when you don't do self-acceptance, what happens is 3 reasons. First, you end up blaming yourself when you don't get the reason you want. For example, if I don't get justification why I lost in certain rounds, I blame my speech in the round. Secondly, I most likely will have existential crisis. I think every debater can relate to this. But lastly, most likely what will happen, and the whole point of this case, is when you self-deprecate yourself, is when you fully put the blame on yourself because you don't get the justification that others can give to you, right? So the harm relies on 2 parties and 2 actors. Not only that you're going to self-deprecate yourself and that hampers yourself as a victim, which I reflect on top of my speech, but also those around you. But also those around you who really doesn't know anything, but you literally just blame them out of nowhere just because you have this sort of validation that you really is thirsty, right? What is a comparative? Comparatively, that's worse than trying to. That's much better. It's worse for you to try to pursue these things that is very arbitrary compared to trying to accept things that is a deadlock and cannot further be breakdown, right? And that is where we think the comparative relies. Why is this argument then important? Because we say in some cases and some circumstances, some things cannot be changed, some things relies on where it has relied lastly, and when you have no control over it, especially things that you cannot control. Yeah, I feel like this is the only way you then can get self-fulfillment. At least you can get happiness from this, and you can move on from the past lives. And this is why we cater into the most vulnerable people, because usually the most vulnerable people happen to get like tragedies that they simply cannot control inherently, right? So under these two arguments, I prove to you firstly that codification of culture is problematic. Secondly, how victims can have better self-acceptance, happiness existing under opening government. So proud to open the case of government.
Right, thank you so much for that fine speech. Now to open the case for the opposition bench, will call upon the leader of opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be excused to the toilet really quickly? Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yeah.
Great. POIs through chat. We open the chat box. On both sides in life, you will be hit with a lot of accidents that really disrupt your psychology. Someday you will probably lose one of your family members. Someday you'll probably lose a friend over something that's really stupid. Maybe you will get rejected from your job or rejected from Harvard or rejected from any single thing that you really, really worked hard for. At these points, I think every individual will have the constant questioning on why that actually happened in their life and why that is actually there. But the problem is that on government side, what people will do and in the absence of this glorification, I think people will just shut down these individuals that keep on questioning it and try to say that that's normal and that you should have to just move on. The comparative on opposition is much better, that we will actually support their seeking of meaning and their seeking of that psychological closure that they so direly need and we are proud to oppose. Before my arguments, in which like all rebuttals will be integrated, just a few mechanisms, some of this also takes down the government case. First, the form of closure is not as inflexible as the government thinks, right? So in opposition, it is not always coming from the validation of other people, right? It depends, of course, on what the people actually need. It can be self-defined. So for example, you can define a chapter of your life that was very, very cruel. Maybe you got, like abandoned by your father, how to be more independent, for example. And that is actually something that is enough for closure because you narrate that part of your life and you define it as something that is inspirational. It can also be through things like investigation. For example, investigating that you are actually rejected from a job because that company was very racist, for example, because you did a background check. So it's not always harming yourself as well. It's not always self-blaming yourself as well. because the process of seeking disclosure is you evaluate everything and you take your time with it and you ask your people around you. I think it is exactly on the government side that you are more likely to jump into destructive conclusions that are based on short-term biases and the biases that you have against yourself or against some people, for example, right? So you are more likely to take those wrong conclusions actually on their side. Second of all, what government has to defend is not free choice of whether you want to reach closure or not. I think that's very uncharitable of them, right? What they have to defend is they leave things ambiguous and just keep on going with life. Why? Because this debate doesn't exist in a vacuum. I think in the status quo, there are existing narratives of individualism because of capitalism, because world is getting really, really hard for everyone to survive. So everyone's becoming more individualistic. So what people are likely to do is actually not care about other people, say that that's normal and that you should just get over it and move on with it. What opposition has to defend is to closure and counterbalance this narrative of individualism and understand that everybody needs to process their struggles. Two arguments. First, why we have better fulfillment for the individual. Second, why we better challenge social inequalities. So first argument, why we have better fulfillment for the individual, right? I think given the previous context of whatever scenarios that I provided before, why is closure best to answer those ambiguities? I think seeking closure is something that is actually difficult, right? But it is better when you glorify this. 4 reasons why. First, I think this is the prerequisite for you to actually do any activities, right? Because at one point you will face a scenario that is so difficult in your life, and on the government side, nobody is going to validate that, and you are going to keep on dwelling in it, and you keep trying to ignore it, but it keeps coming up as questions at night, for example, or it disrupts you in the middle of work and makes you unproductive, actually, right? On opposition, you reach an evaluation with yourself, you allow yourself to take your time to process that emotion and actually try to reach a conclusion that is beneficial for you and for your narrative, right? That is the point where you can actually start doing those other activities because you are able to get over this and you are able to now accept that you are probably not the one who you are before, that your past problem does not define you anymore, and that you are ready to take on a new life. Second of all, there's a constant evaluation of what if and where you actually belong. I think if government wants to talk about things like opportunity cost that is lost when you are thinking about these jobs, about your loss, for example, that is actually worse on government side. Because on government side, you accept everything that happens in the status quo, right? You accept that you are in a mediocre job. You accept that you got rejected from a job unfairly, even though it was because of racism, for example. On opposition, when you constantly evaluate, you are more likely to do things like investigate these structural racism, for example, or you try to challenge yourself even more because you probably can reach higher echelons in terms of your performance and your job. That means that opportunity cost is worse on their side. Thirdly, you take risks to challenge the status quo, right? I think you are likely to do things like leave a toxic friend group, for example, or go to a therapist, for example, or ask questions to your lover who you haven't been really getting along with, right? Because perhaps this might fix your problems, because this perhaps will stop making you like an insomniac at night, for example, because you keep on thinking about that, right? You take the risk, and that courage is exclusively on our side when that pursuit of closure is glorified. Fourthly, I think you're likely to define life in a way that's beneficial for you as well. On the government side, either your life has no meaning or you follow whatever society says about you, and I think that's going to be very, very unbeneficial for the people who are underprivileged. On opposition, you define it by yourself, that this one failure in your life is a stepping stone to growth, for example. You are more able to see things in a positive way when you form your own story. Why is this likely? Because the human nature is that they're going to be like doing things that are self-beneficial and self-gratifying. So at the end of the day, this is going to be possible, even though it's difficult. You just have to take your time to do this. Why is this argument important? Firstly, you normalize seeking positive things for yourself. On government side, people have no courage or energy to talk to their like very, very confrontational friends, for example, or try things that are new. On opposition, there's this narrative, your societal circles actually support this as well, so you get that, that exclusive push on our side. Second of all, we give space for underprivileged people that get oppressed, because conflict, unlike what opening government says, is not a priori bad. The comparative on their side is worse, which is silence, which means that you let the ones in power stay in power and the ones that are at the bottom never change. I think it's better to actually have these conflicts, because at the end of the day, you can demand something back finally from those who are in power. Thirdly, you act better in the future to prevent things that will disrupt your closure as well, preventing like future woes, etc. Right? So, second argument, where we have better, we better challenge social inequalities. I think in the status quo, there are simply lots of invisible barriers, right? And like, you don't investigate this on the government side. What do you do on opposition? Firstly, you investigate this, you scrutinize the system, and you actually criticize it. So you actually, actually report things for like job unfairness, for example, and you actually bring this to court. Second of all, you actually finish that court, right? You actually have people supporting the lawsuit until the end. You have things like donations that are supporting you, even though the process is very, very, tiring. And on the government side, you will probably give up because it is so tiring, for example. So unfairness is better solved on our side. But that's like that, right? I think the most important thing that will win us this debate is if we answer the worst case of why, if you fail the pursuit, it's going to still be okay. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, at least you have something to look forward to in life. On government side, you are easily bored because your sources of gratification are things like hedonic treadmill, from things like capitalism, from drinks that you probably like to buy, or games that are there in the next month. But over time those gets boring, right? Because they actually do not have any meaning in your life. They're just distractions. On opposition, you seek answers to questions that actually stick in your mind, that constantly evolve, and that actually evolve to new heights, and that actually give you better kinds of gratification on our side because they evolve. Secondly, people who cannot achieve closure are exactly the most vulnerable people that need this narrative, because these are people who can never move on from their tragedy, for example, that need help from their friends, and which the help only comes exclusively on opposition. On government side, what happens is the average person who has a hard time putting themselves into another person's perspective will just simplify and demean your life struggles as a much worse comparative. That's why we're proud to oppose.
Right, thank you so much for that fine speech. Now, to extend the case of the opening government bench, we'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Saya sama dulu. Okay, POI through chat. I promise I'll check the chat box. Starting my speech in 3, 2. I think that the biggest flaw for opening opposition is that exactly when they play the scenario that this person would going to always get the closure the moment when they demand it. But this is not the case in status quo. Some of you could not even asking for closure, even when you have already doing anything to asking for closure. Or some of you got the the answer that you got the answer from this kind of person, but that answer is not coming with your satisfactions. It means that there is no closure given towards you, no matter how hard you try. Sometimes you could not even get the closures in the end of the day. We think that this is the scenarios that we are currently debating. Because people who already got the closure that they really want will not even get affected with glorifications to pursue these closures in the end of the day. This is exactly why we think that opposition need to deal with the cases where this person could not even get the closure, why the glorification of it is basically good in the end of the day, right? Before moving on my cases, clarifications in where opening government stands. First of all, we do not hate people that asking for closure. We just hate the clarifications in the end of the day. We do admit that at some extent you need to ask him for the answers in the end of the day. But we think that the clarifications manifested differently when differently in the end of the day, right? With the glorifications in the end of the day, these people do not have any other choices other than asking for closures in the end of the day. Some of us do not want to ask for closure exactly because we do not want to prolong the cases in the end of the day. Or these glorifications at some extent overwhelm the other narrative that Tata tried to prove to you, such as acceptance and so on and so forth. Well, at some extent, the other narrative could give better healings toward this kind of person in the end of the day. The choices in which kind of narrative that is better for use as a self-healings is basically overwhelmed the moment when there is a glorifications inside of it. This is exactly why we oppose the glorifications in the of the day, exactly because it could not give a counter narrative that might be better rather than asking for a closure when there is an absence towards the closures in the end of the day. Second of all, we've told you that there is an arbitrariness in regards of closures in the end of the day. People sometimes even could be so evil. They hurt you, but they do not even feel sorry for what they did in the end of the day. They do not know that what they did is basically wrong in the end of the day. How are you going to asking for closure toward this kind of people? There's going to be a deadlock for this kind of situations in the end of the day. This is exactly why within that when there's an absence of closure, asking for other choices, other way of doing self-healings would even be better. And this is exactly why we stand for opening government, right? But the last ones, we think that even with the glorifications of this kind of closures, pursuing for closures, people who still having enough incentive to give you closure when they really want to maintain your relationship in the end of the day, right? They understand that if they could not give you a satisfaction answer towards your closure, they would going to lose you in the end of the day. This is where it stands for a human relationship in the end of the day. So the moment when they give you no closure, at some extent, it's not because they do not want to give you closure, but this is what they could get in the end of the day. The examples, when you are breaking up with your boyfriend, the moment when there's a glorification of closure, you are going to ask him what happened. If he answered to you, I got bored, so that's why I break up with you. Those kind of answers all automatically gonna give you a closure, exactly because it doesn't give you justice that you're wants in the end of the day. But how else that he can do? He could do nothing, exactly because the main reason why he broke up with you is exactly because he broke up, and there's no any other reasons behind that. This is where we believe that in the end of the day, asking for closure could be a very toxic glorifications if this is not within the right scenarios. And this is exactly why we believe that it will be better when there's a choices instead of what this person do in the end of the day, right? But so let's moving on issues that happen in this debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about how the victim would even going to feel worse the moment that when there's a glorifications inside of it. And second of all, I'm going to deal with the inequalities that being the main cases of opening up associations, right? Moving on, my first issues, how victim will even going to feel worse if there's a glorifications in the end of the day. But before moving, yes, CEO.
I'm curious on how do you see status quo? Is status quo glorifying seeking foreclosure? Because I can't see how you against glorifying, but
all right. This is basically what going to be explained in my extensions, right? So let's moving on my first issue in regard of how victim would going to be feel worse in the end of the day. We believe that when there is a glorifications, people will try to guilt tripping this victim the moment when they got no closures in the end of the day. The likelihood is that of it is that first, within when there is a glorifications, you are going to create an automatic scenario that if you got no closures, means that this problem is not basically solved in the end of the day. When there is no closure given towards you, means that you need to ask them to give closure no matter how hard it is and no matter how long it is in the end of the day. We think that this is bad, exactly because for this kind of victim, you are going to be trapped in this kind of scenario forever, right? You are demanded by your surroundings, for example. So always constantly ask this person what is their answers and so on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen. At some extent, people do not want this. At some extent, when we are talking about victims that highly traumatized with the conditions that they are living in, this is not something that's basically good in the end of the day. If you are breaking up with your boyfriend and your boyfriend do not even give you a correct answers and you are giving up, people will see you as a stupid ex-girlfriend in the end of the day. This is where we believe that glorification could be very toxic, exactly because it gives no chances for this victim to moving on in the end of the day. Even if it has resulted into this kind of victim, for example, victims of sexual harassment do not want to appeal to the court. We think that this is fine in the end of the day because they have every right to be selfish. Being victim is basically not okay. Dealing with everything that they got is basically hard in the end of the day. This is where we believe that even when they choose to forget, even if they choose to accept and not appeal it to the court, we think that they have every right to do so. And this is exactly why we believe that glorifications is basically okay. We think that this is very important for these kinds of people to move on. The way people got peace is basically different towards each and another. Within that, these glorifications do not allow us to have a customized way of us dealing with this kind of scenarios, and this is exactly why we believe that this is bad. But however, we think that if you face certain inequalities, certain discriminations, and so on and so forth, we think that you are always have any incentive to demand for the justice, exactly because it might hamper you in your the way you are living and so on and so forth, but it doesn't have any correlation with how you are moving on with the problem. We're very proud to
Right, thank you so much for that fine speech. Now, to wrap up the first half of the debate, we'll call upon the Deputy Leader of
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. Okay. Setting up my GDocs. Sorting out my argument. Yeah. If you want to help you, I just do it through chat. Wait. Do not pronounce your name. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. One clarification first. I think you need to differentiate between closure and post-closure. Closure is when you get a firm answer to questions. Post-closure is how you react toward the answer that you got from that question. Why this clarification is important? This is to engage to the whole fascia speech in regards to like their projections of their problematic. Say that when you got an answer from your boyfriend that he's breaking up with you because they are bored, that is a closure. The way you got justice upon your boyfriend problematic behavior, that is post-closure. So I don't think that the idea of seeking for justice is something that's relevant toward debate. But what's relevant then is how you have incentive to asking yourself, to asking your boyfriend in the very first place on why the boyfriend breaking up with you. This is exactly why in the house you get the marginal benefit that you actually know that your boyfriend is problematic, as opposed to that you're going to self-load yourself because of the overwhelming uncertainty, because you don't have incentive to have pursuit of closure. You're going to, okay, maybe they broke up with me because I am the one that is at fault on the relationship. Why? That is exactly why the incentive to question exactly happen exclusive and outside the house, never going to happen on OG's cases. But I'm going to answer the biggest argument regarding like subjective people's demand of closure. If it is true that this is the problem, we question why this is not solvable in outside the house when we create glorification of pursuit of closure, because glorification is exactly the mechanism for you for your subjective demand of closure to be heard by the society. Why? Because when we emphasize the importance of closure in social norms, there is a need and necessity to be attained by each individual with adherence to their individual interests. This is where societies will going to open up conversations of what exactly your demand is and how you can gain happiness throughout this closure, right? That is going to have more conversation how you can gain closure or how you can achieve better closure. That thing, with this we also prove to you that closure is very attainable in the house, even if it is subjective, right? This is important though. Why? Because we need to realize ambiguity is suffocating, because it is a proof that life is uncertain and not formed. So therefore, the solvency of ambiguity of life is something that individuals and humanity need to pursue about. And it's inevitable in both sides of the house that ambiguity exists, right? But the way we can lessen the suffocation is by sharing the pain and communicating with people that have similar experience with you. For example, those people that are not breaking the tournament together, for example, right? The people that is having in a similar number of like team taps, for example, right? It can only be achieved if you glorify that this is a norm of necessity. Because what happened in the side of the house when you don't glorify it, pursuit of closure is something that is not important for society to pursue, right? Worst case is that people are going to be dwell in their own sadness with no incentive for it to have closure and moving on into much more productive life, for example, right? I think that like the idea of like dwelling in suffering is something that is actually very addicting, for example. But then how you can actually share the pain is something that needs to be incentivized, that only happens when you glorify this narrative. Before that, OG.
Yes, isn't people not okay with ambiguity? It's basically crafted exactly because of this glorification.
Yeah. We already told to you that ambiguity was going to exist in both sides of the house, but how you can have incentive to solve that ambiguity never being answered in opening government case. I don't understand what this UI merit about, right? But like I'm going to continue, right? That means, but secondly is that we flip the benefit of what OG offer in regards to individual happiness. This is also why my LO speech makes sense, is that you are not going to get individual happiness because you are going to drive yourself to destructive conclusions and short-term biasness when you evaluate such cases. Self-loathing is much more certain in their side of the house, because in evaluating the problem, the most bigger involving factor and equation is yourself, that largely involved in that even, right? Not the educator, for example, and whatnot. So the likelihood for you to blame yourself in a short-term thinking and evaluating analysis and your biasness of yourself is huge. That means in outside the house, what's the benefit then? Is that we're going to taking more consideration and evaluating thoroughly during the pursuit of closure that there are other possibilities maybe you can consider. For example, like the ages are bad, the educators are bad, for example, or the connection turns out are very shitty during the day, so educators cannot hear you well, for example. Those are like possibilities that you can actually gain in regards to evaluating the cases. If only you are incentivizing to have pursuit of closure, you want to have incentive to evaluate the cases much more thorough, as opposed to like forcing coerce yourself into self-acceptance and whatnot, and self-conclusions and whatnot, right? But the biggest questions in opening in government banks is that why why closure is something that is actually accessible for all age for all people. In regards to that, I think that my LO has proved to you that I think that the idea of closure, especially when it comes to like tragedy is inevitable, right? Most people don't have like all that rainbows. Like most people probably have their lost their loved one and whatnot. So how then they can have closure in the house, right? Because I think people can distract from questions with money in the house and hedonic treadmill, for example, to actually avoid those kind of questions that making themselves at night, for example. But not poor people, right? The idea that the idea of like therapies is actually very, very expensive in their side of the house will never going to be solved if there is no awakening of necessity that actually closure is something that's actually important for humanity to thrive, right? Especially like poor people who need closure because like the idea of like happiness is very rare. They don't have any money, so therefore I think the way they can gain happiness is only by actually like answering those kind of questions and pursuing the answer of that questions, right? But secondly, but like lastly, is that OG never answers of the benefit that we already shortlisted that we provide you, which is much more gradual, which are much more gradual as opposed to OGs like individual closure and whatnot. Number one is that there is incentive for people to fight the system due to the fact there's an ambiguity of birth lottery, or whether or not like you are poor because you are destined to be, or that you are poor because you are living in a corruptive system, for example. This is where like the idea, the pursuit of closure that you are actually like poor because of corruptive system can only be achieved like the realization of that, and like the way you can fight it is only happens when you pursue the closure. But second is the motivation of life. That the moment tomorrow you can have another question that you need to answer and whatnot. This is way that you need that there is an increasing survivability of humanity as opposed to the house. The human will be very, very boring. But lastly, epistemic humility, right? That means that people are going to pursue much more knowledge. For example, like space race, exactly why space race happen exactly because of like humans seeking for closure of what actually knowledge is about and whatnot. Better development of civilizations. We already.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now to open the second half of the debate, we'll call upon the member of the government team. Here. Oh yeah, sure. Okay, member, you can continue.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Prefer gender pronoun, she, her, please POI through chat. Because voice is going to be distracting. Before I start my speech, several trigger warning, discussion regarding child abuse, rape, and social injustices. And just like I would like to dedicate this speech towards my siblings, the bunch of strongest people I know in this world. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG is a bench that believes that the world where the hegemony of narrative that you need to find closure in order to move on, you need to find closure in order to heal and continue with your life is shit. It's painful and we're not something that people deserve to be put in that kind of pressure. We believe that holding a certain grudges, holding a certain amount of grief and anger is something that is productive and healthy and good. We believe that although OG's explanation are appreciated, unclear what is the difference between acceptance with closure at the end of the day, and we're going to show to you how the world really differs at the end of the day. But first, let's notice, it was super weird case, right? Because it's super worst case, because first, when you don't pursue closure, it doesn't mean that you're staying still. It doesn't mean that you're fixated on that. It doesn't mean that you're not doing anything about it. And they don't defend a world where the glorification of these narratives exists. They defend a world where finding closure is good, but they need to defend a world where people constantly berate you and barge you with the pressure of you need to find closure, and you need to move on from this problem continuously, and the overwhelming narrative of it. Because people will be centered around quickly trying to close up the page and move on eventually, because it's perceived as a prerequisite of healing and moving on, and just like they say, to be functioning at the end of the day. Realistically, this is not something that's possible and accessible at the end of the day, because there are problems that does not have closure, and sometimes you just need to pick and choose what type of burden that you want to carry on your shoulder and continue with your life at the end of the day, and what type of grief that you want to hold on. They continuously run away from the burden to prove that seeking closure is a better method towards healing, because it is an important analysis for you to consider to pick which type of world is something that is more preferable at the end of the day. We think that when the hegemony of closure does not entail people to become more truthful, just like what DLO said, because this debate does not happen in a vacuum. People's tendency to not wanting to be in the wrong, being defensive, and interest of self-protection will continuously exist at the end of the day, while society will force you to accept and just close the book up. We do not think that this is a healthy mechanism to continue with your life at the end of the day. When you are stuck in a constant pursuit of closure because you feel like it's the only way for you to move on and to continue with your life, and compared to you being stuck with the issue and not letting go the anger, your response is going to be the same. You're still going to be fixated with it. You're going to still constantly thinking about it and focusing your energy towards your trauma. But the difference is that when the dominant narrative is you have to find a firm closure, you have to find the answer, it makes it hard for you to get out of this cycle of fixation at the end of the day. Well, you're not fixated of trying to find the answer, be it a self-implied reality or a true answer. You can have the ability to put the things that you are traumatized with in the back burner and move on. If to some extent you will still continuously revisit the trauma because it's not solved, and you still have to question why this happens to you at the end of the day. You accept and internalize the absence of answer, because as individuals, you can learn how to adapt and compartmentalize things at the end of the day. We think it's something that is healthy. Now, I'm going to prove to you why, even in the world where you hold grudges, you can still become a functioning human being, and you can still use this towards beautiful things. First, when you are faced with the uncertainty of loved ones that passed away, you feel regret because you never show enough affections towards them, or you hold grudges and you hold anger towards your mother that abuses you for 20 years of your life and continuously deprive you of love and affection. When you hold on to those anger, when you hold on to that grief, you can still become a functioning, because this oftentimes become a source of motivation for a lot of people. For example, a lot of abused kids will try to get out from that household, that will try to become high achieving, have a good job, or to become a better parents, because they notice how painful it is to be not loved, to feel like you're a piece of shit that is imposed by your parents. You will motivate yourself to become a better sister because your affection towards your siblings at the end of the day. And we think that living out a fight is something that is okay, because you can still find happiness when you have a better life. Also affect movement, because movement stems from anger. It doesn't stem from you finding closure. This is something that fuels to create protection for sexual assault victims and so on and so forth, because closure makes you compromise with your perpetrator, because in order for accept the answer towards your abuse, to accept the tragedy that you have, it entails you to see things from their perspective of your abuser. You understand them in order to accept what is happening to you, and it's damaging because you are gaslighting yourself. You accept things that you don't actually deserve. We know what damage that done to you is something that is irreversible.
And you also have to curse your loved ones because you're constantly foreshadowed with the fact that you don't do enough for the one that has passed you at the end of the day. I think that the narrative of closure puts you in a vulnerable position to continuously be gaslighted by your abuser and people surrounding you. Because there is no justification in this world that could justify the reason of abuse. Why, as a kid, you were locked outside of your house on a cold night? Why you were being touched in the back of school bus by your seniors? Or why your partner cheated on you at the end of the day. If you know the reason, it does not mean that you can accept those reasons, making closure not accessible at all for everyone, especially when there's asymmetry of power. And secondly, you are going to be continuously gaslighted by the society. They invalidate your feelings because you have to move on, even if it's with good intentions, going to be damaging because you cannot process your grief or emotional turmoil with your own terms. The trauma that you experience leaves handprints on you. It leaves marks and shapes you to another being. There is something that is very, very painful because there's going to be a lot of residual issues that you're not going to be able to process while accepting the tragedy that you experience and like forcing closure at the end of the day. For example, after getting out of toxic family, you're going to be forced to forgive by people around you because you need to move on, or they do it out of love and whatnot at the end of the day. Maybe you can forgive them, but you're going to miss the opportunity to truly dissect the abuse that you experience and the impact that you have. And this takes time. And when you're not fixated on closure, you can process as long as you take to internalize the trauma, notice the changes that you experience at the end of the day, and it gives you better opportunity to help yourself move on healthily from the trauma at the end of the day. And we think that in both worlds, reason behind trauma is uncertain. You cannot know definitely why this is something that is happening to you, but what is certain is how it impacts you as a person. And we think it's important for you to create a world that allows people to be able to process the impact that they experience and truly notice how it impacts, how it changes their own individual. We are very proud to live in a world that does not gaslight.
So much for that speech. Now, to wrap up the case for the entire government bench, we'll call upon the government web. Here.
Yeah. All right. Am I audible? Before my speech, I want to say thank you for my amazing teammate for an amazing run on the competition. You do an amazing job earlier. Gender pronouns, she or her. But please refer me as my son. What else? Your preference through unmuting yourself, but please take like 10, 20 seconds of gap before you shoot your second chance. Also, like previous ones, probably there's some sensitive things. Probably I'm going to cry as well, but yeah, I'll try to hold on. Okay. Going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG defend the world where we can live with uncertainty. We can live with the ambiguity that OO tried to criticize. We think that at least it's a healthy process that individual can access, because not everyone can even go through the pursuit process, because it's not a guaranteed process where it can be healthy for some individual. Exactly, because the trauma, grief, anger, fury that had towards the world is very diverse to one another. And we think that the glorification will only hamper this individual, exactly what my member already well established. Independent rebuttal. Firstly, they think that, at least attempt to pursue this. But the thing is that the worst case under their scenario is not people finally appease themselves with the bare minimum answer that they can accept with, but it's also where you constantly being trivialized, you're constantly being delegitimate, because your grief or anger should not last more than 10 or 20 years as what normal people do when they all have the pursuit of happiness or pursuit of closure to begin with. Because what happened when it's glorified, right? Because there will be an objective or a standard or parameter of what normal closure that individual usually went through. For example, grief, people can grieve for 5 or 10 years. That will be normal, but more than that, I think you're a little bit crazy. But we think that no, right? We want to live in where we can carry on the grief, we can carry on the anger and fury, and exactly in CG we already explained you, it can manifest into a lot of beautiful things afterwards. But a second independent rebuttal. Why then? I think why then this need to be clarified very importantly. What OO tried to say to you, your reaction to post closure is different. We think that if your post closure reaction is bad, that you still questioning, or you are being angered or being angry or being sad because of the closure, the answers that you had, that doesn't mean you reach closure. That means that there are another question that you need to answer, exactly because you in constant pursuit, because there will be another question afterwards. Post trial, you already got your justice, the perpetrator already being punished, but still you have question and self-victimizing exactly as what they did. I think this process is not accessible for everyone to underwent with, and only under CG we will not gaslight this individual. We will not victimize and also the self-victim in court that need to be answered. Yes, points.
Government badge argument only works insofar as it is more difficult for people to reach closure than to ignore those problems. We told you ignoring the problems is really hard, and people are going to just ignore everyone's problems on government side. Why do you solve that?
Okay, we already told you that we can choose, pick, and fight what kind of war and pain that we want to process. Of course, it's not going to be hard, but even if we need to carry on the trauma, we are going to be okay, because there will be no friends or family or work colleagues that told you that it's not okay for you to keep reliving the trauma or keep thinking and or keep thinking and not finding answer of those trauma that irreversible to begin with. We talk about childhood trauma, we talk about rape, sexual assaults that irreversible to begin with, and the way that you have to process it exactly have to cater in the way that you find it suitable, right? Because under our worst case scenario, under their side of the world is that, yeah, sure, people will accommodate you to therapy, but it's not going to be healthy, right? Because you're not ready to talk about it, or you're not ready to face the questions that you were so desperately want to avoid. But still, even if that's the case, you can still be very productive and functional human being. There's a lot of externalities and internal factors that force you to do that. You need to find money to survive, for example. Victims of childhood abuse have to take care of their sisters, their siblings, so they can get their siblings out of their houses, exactly because they also have certain motivation, although they still holding to exactly the grudges and anger that they had inside of them. And we already proved to you that it can manifest, although you need to feel constantly depressed about it, you're going to have episodes about it, but still you can work, you can suck it up, and you can also carry on with helping and manifest this anger into something that are productive. But safety net also exists, right? I carry on a lot of grief and anger that I don't want to reach closure with, but I still vent it out to my friends and they do not judge me. This is the ideal world that CG want to defend. They do not judge me for having grieving for 11 fucking years, and it's okay for them to hear that, because exactly they do not tell me to, you should talk about it in your therapy. You should not, keep grieving about someone that already passed away so long ago. They can still be productive. I am a corporate slave and I'm still being very productive, although all of these episodes disrupt me, but still there's a lot of beautiful things that I can see about the world. And I think this is the ideal world where we can still survive and strive, although and not having people constantly telling you where closure is required and needed. But most likely, right, under their side of the house, when you cannot reach closure, because again they want to defend pursuit, right? When you cannot reach closure, you're going to create a distorted reality. You're going to disillusion yourself, because the answer that you're going to accept is either bare minimum or something that you cannot accept. What would this mean? this will manifest even harder for this individual. The self-victimizing are going to be worsened under their side of the house because they were going to be wrapped in reality that they can accept with, because exactly people pushing them for having this kind of closure. But what even worse is that if you have the bare minimum answers of disclosure, you need to compromise, which is bad, right? Compromising mean you're going to have certain trade-off of yourself. For example, you're going to accept that, yeah, maybe I'm being irrational, maybe I'm being possessive, and then it's going to manifest into a bad thing under their side of the house. Self-victimizing will flourishing under their side of the house. So what we CG already told to you, we say that it's okay for people holding their grief and fury, because most likely this is what you can accept and bear with. Different individual have different pace in their life, have different trauma, and we think that the glorification will only gaslight you even further. The whole is proud to close the government.